If you see the glass as always being half full, your life could be full of happiness.
Much to everyone's surprise, Jonas sat up and moved to the teacher's desk. He pulled open a few drawers as if looking for something. Upon not finding it, he then grabbed a nail file from one of the recesses. They watched with interest as he jammed the nail file into the locked drawer and pried the desk drawer open. Those locks really weren't made for security purposes. They were there to give the illusion of security, and Jonas easily pried the door open. He smiled as he reached into the once-locked drawer and pulled the item out. He thunked the bottle of cheap vodka on the desk. He spoke. "I will give you this entire bottle if you kill the fellow with the megaphone out there." There was a moment of stunned silence before they dissolved into laughter. Harriet grabbed the cheap plastic handle of the vodka and said,
"A promise is a promise."
The joke wasn't that funny, but it gave them something else to do than think about the 15 dead people below them, so they laughed. Tears welled in their eyes as the laughter rolled through them. Finnegan laughed until a fit of coughing stopped him. Lou asked, "How did you know she had a bottle in there?" Jonas rubbed the back of his neck and said, "She had the shakes and was doused in perfume. A high-functioning alcoholic was the most likely scenario." Andrew walked up to the desk and said,
"Thank God for people and their inner demons."
The class quickly divided into who was drinking and who wasn't. Jennifer refused on principle, and Michaela refused due to her drinking buddies. Harriet wouldn't have been surprised if she turned her nose up at them a few times before the night was done. Geraldo wanted to stay sharp, and Patrick didn't feel up to drinking. Jonas tried to join the others, but was pulled into a few shots by an insistent Harriet. The vodka could only be described as cheap, with its plastic, shatterproof bottle, and its taste that was like drinking lighter fluid, and then swallowing a lit match. Most of the students didn't mind as it achieved its purpose of putting fire into their bellies. Harriet went through a bit of a phase a couple months back. She went to parties, got drunk, did a lot of things she would come to regret. She had decided not to dwell on it. Instead, she took another shot of the paint-thinner vodka and let a warm feeling suffuse itself into her body. She was certain that Edward hadn't ever tasted liquor because he winced every shot. It was kind of cute, like watching a baby first take a bite into a lemon. She knew Lou had managed to get a few gigs with his band in a bar and probably had a couple of drinks after the show. She went to one of his shows once, but was so drunk that she only had an inkling of an image of him standing by the stage afterwards with a red silo cup in his hand. Joseph seemed to be drinking only socially. He took a nip every now and then, but was mainly attempting to engage others in conversation. He chatted with Eddie about sci-fi movies and pulled Lou into a lengthy conversation about philosophy. She wasn't sure if Andrew even knew the definition of moderate, as every time the bottle was passed to him, he chugged it like it was water. Like always, Jonas seemed to be an enigma wrapped in a mystery. His face was impassive after every shot. Everyone coughed or winced after a shot except for him. Joseph managed to pull everyone into a conversation except for Jonas. He drank perfunctory, like a clockwork machine, and watched everyone from the corner of his eye. Jonas tipped the plastic bottle over and said, "Dead soldier." Andy nodded and said,
"I wish."
Andy walked up to the window and opened it all the way. He climbed up on the shelf and began unzipping his pants before Harriet could ask. He took himself out of his pants and started pissing out of the window. He shouted,
"You think I'm scared of all you and your dick wagging? This is so you can see who's the big swinging dick around these parts."
She waited with bated breath to see if he would catch a bullet for taunting the soldiers. Andrew continued rocking back and forth on the windowsill while shouting vulgarities at them and pissing in their direction.
Is this literally going to become a pissing contest?
With a flash, a massive spotlight kicked on and illuminated him with light. He stood in the window in shock as the light bathed him and exposed him to those who were still in the class.
Not a bad specimen, but his personality is radioactive.
He stumbled back and fell off the shelves. The spotlight swept the window as if looking for the source of the shouts. Lou smiled and exchanged a glance with Joseph. The same idea ran through them both. They worked with their belts and undid them. The realization what they were about to do dawned on Edward, and he struggled to catch up with them. They both dropped their pants at the same time and mooned the shoulders just as a searchlight rolled over them. Edward joined them a few seconds later, and they all dissolved into laughter. Jonas walked off as they shouted and taunted the soldiers. Harriet followed him out into the hall. She wanted answers that only he had. She called out softly to him in the hallway. He turned to her and she asked, "Who are you?" He responded simply, "I'm Jonas Salk. We have 2 classes together. I don't know if I should be offended by you not knowing my name or whatever." She pressed. "No, I know almost everyone in this classroom except you. Edward is some sort of genius. He's lacking social skills, that's for sure. Patrick is so driven to escape that he doesn't realize the danger of trying to escape a quarantine. Joe is trying to play everything cool and calm, but he's anything but. Andy is caustic and definitely likes to grind people's gears." Jonas interrupted with his own analysis of the class. He spoke calmly and deadpan. "Most likely has an oppositional defiance disorder. Michaela thinks she has control over the soldiers due to her status, but not really. She's best kept away from discussions. Lou is dealing with a sudden growth in popularity and is wondering which of his friends are true or fair weather. His amiability makes him an effective leader in this situation. Jennifer believes she can outthink everyone, but is not equipped to handle pressure. She's most likely going to be the first one to snap under pressure. You, Harriet," she growled. "Don't you distill me down to a few sentences. There are more to us than that. We're people, goddammit." He began again. "I am Jonas. My strength lies in reading this situation. Most likely I have some form of Asperger's syndrome or a social disorder. I will never be able to unify everyone. That's your talent. You can be the mediator to their conflicts. We are on the precipice between barbarity and order. This is only going to get worse. You can be the one that saves us all." Her face softened and she said, "I'm going to get to bed and sleep this off. I'll see you in the morning." He nodded and she laughed. "I can be the one to save them all." The words rang in her head, but she never took into account the fact that not everyone can be saved. The University of Liverpool posted that brain size directly impacts the number of social connections a brain can form. The range is 135 to 150 meaningful connections. Edward woke up with a pounding headache and the feeling that felt like he had gargled a foul-tasting molasses just before going to bed. Imbibing in alcohol can dehydrate the body. Most of the effects of a hangover correlate with symptoms of dehydration. He ticked through the symptoms of binge drinking and nodded at the symptoms he was experiencing. He even handled his first hangover like it was a scientific expedition. He went to the water fountain outside and washed his mouth out a few times. He drank about a liter of water. Filling his stomach and rehydrating were surefire methods to alleviate the symptoms of a hangover. His stomach was growling, so he moved to the desk and helped himself to a granola bar that had been scrounged from neighboring classrooms. He didn't black out last night, but there was a slight haze to the festivities. He recalled talking with Joe about whether Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or Killer Clowns from Outer Space made more intimidating monsters. They decided that the Tomatoes had more gumption and had actually had sequels and thus were the winner. He remembered mooning the soldiers. We're probably going to face some retaliation for that little rebellion later on. There was no use dwelling on it. They couldn't dress it up, and apologizing would be a venture into the futile. They had already shit the bed, so to speak, and trying to spray Febreze on it wasn't going to make it any better. He stretched and looked outside classroom 300. When they started to drink last night, the group had split into two. Those who didn't want to drink went to another room, whilst those who opted to get drunk stayed in classroom 300. Drinking just 10 feet away from a classroom full of corpses. Sounds like a Russian novel. He looked at the others in the room with him. Joseph was sleeping contentedly, using his backpack as a pillow. Andrew was sprawled out on the floor without anything to use to cushion his head. Jonas wasn't in the classroom. Lou had curled up on the floor with his head resting on the crook of his arm. Harriet had her head up against the wall, and her head was resting on her knees. His awakening seemed to serve as a catalyst, as slowly the other revelers began to wake up. They all stretched and looked uncomfortably at each other, Lou and Joe about mooning a group of soldiers who currently had their lives in their hands. Andrew seemed to be carrying the brunt of the awkwardness. He probably remembered exposing himself to the soldiers in an act of bravado. He wouldn't look people in the eyes, and Edward tried to remember if Andrew was insecure about his size. He smiled inwardly and said,
"Let's meet up with the others."
Most grunted their approval and assent. They left the classroom that now reeked of a cloying smell of death. They located the other students in classroom 303 that was on the same side of the building, but occupied the other corner. It was the furthest away from the corpses, but was still adjacent to the barricade. Jennifer spat upon seeing the others come into the room.
"Here come the luscious. Did you enjoy yourselves last night?"
Michaela chided.
"So, Harriet, I know you hooked up with at least one of them whilst intoxicated. What's your modus operandi now? Pray tell, who was the lucky, now syphilitic gentleman?"
Before Harriet could fire back with a caustic rejoinder, the megaphone screeched into the mid-morning air, and the voice piece spoke to the quarantined students. The mouthpiece spoke in a cheery tone.
"Morning. I heard you all had quite a busy night last night."
"Fuck you, you shit-sucking cockroach. If you don't have anything important to say to us, shut your goddamn mouth."
One part of the class was too stunned to interfere with Wakefield's diatribe, and the other part was wishing they could express the same sentiments. He raised the megaphone to his mouth and boomed.
"I would prefer the company of Miss Wagner."
"Too bad, crotch rot, you're talking to me. She doesn't feel like talking to a limp dick, impotent, withered old husk such as yourself."
The megaphone man raised the tool again to talk, but Andrew continued his rant.
"You see, you failed to deliver on your promise. Where's our food? We're starving here."
"The food is coming."
"You're more full of shit than a porta potty, Pops. You're just a toady. Let me speak to the big swinging dick here. Let me speak to Mr. Tuskegee Experiment. I want to talk to the MK Ultra. I'm tired of palling around with Mr. Puppet."
"If you just let me talk."
Andrew roared, and it was as if his voice was amplified stronger than the megaphone itself.
"We're tired of talking to marionettes. You talk and achieve nothing. We're tired of going around in circles. We're tired of you, Det."
The realization of what he was about to say stole Andrew's words away, and the man with the megaphone used that opportunity to seize control of the conversation.
"I was trying to say before I was so rudely interrupted by such a crass and crude individual."
"Both those words mean the same thing, asshole."
"That we now have new information on the biological entity that has made this quarantine necessary. We know the symptoms that you should be vigilant for. We have identified the virus that you've been exposed to."
Silence reigned supreme in the class. The man continued.
"The first symptoms are cold-esque in nature. The incubation period for the symptoms to become manifest in 24 hours after exposure. Intermediary stages are extreme lethargy and dementia. This stage can last 1 to 2 days depending on your immune systems. The final stages are very similar to hemorrhagic fever, bleeding from the nose, eyes, ears, and any orifice really. In this final stage, the person is highly infectious and can contaminate others through bodily fluids, close proximity, and physical contact. The final stage lasts 2 to 3 hours before death."
The man with the megaphone waited for his words to sink in with the class before continuing.
"We highly suggest isolating people that show signs of early infection. We have our top scientists working on a cure at this very moment, but it will take time. Keep calm. Losing your patience or flying off the handle could sign the death warrant for you and your friends. We'll bring you food and the cure when we manage to fully understand its effects.
He set down the megaphone and walked off in a brisk manner. The words hung throughout the classroom and rendered the situation in a brutal clarity. They could be infected with this fatal virus and could die within days. The only thing that could be heard amongst the shell-shocked students was the relentless coughing of Patrick Finnegan. Slowly, the dark realization began to set upon them like an ancient Lovecraftian horror, insinuating itself throughout their minds, corrupting their thoughts.
Liston is staggering. Clay is rocking him with a combination. Clay is killing him. Sonny Liston is down.
Patrick doubled over coughing. It seemed to everyone like his next fit of coughing would result in him ejecting a lung from his body. Andrew Wakefield was the first to make the connection and take the initiative. He growled,
You son of a bitch, you're infected!
Part of the class gave out stifled shrieks and gasps. They were now coming face to face with the infection. They were coming face to face with their own mortality. He tried to shake his head and deny the claim, but a flurry of coughs rendered him incapable. Wakefield snarled.
When were you gonna tell us, Typhoid Timmy? After you infected all of us, or when you became a fucking plague victim? You're a goddamn Trojan horse!
Jonas looked at Lewis, who jumped to Patrick's defense. He shouted,
Don't put ideas in their heads. We're all scared enough as it is. He had that cough before all of this started. He was hacking and wheezing 2 days ago.
Edward said.
According to the data we were given, Patrick should have slipped into delirium or lethargy by now if he was infected. Can it, Nerdlinger? The dumb ox may not have been infected then, but look at him now. He's coughing more than a tuberculosis ward.
Jenny agreed.
With a cough like that, he has to be immunocompromised. He's a ticking time bomb. God, I don't want to catch it.
Patrick hacked out.
Guys, I'm not infected.
A cold. It's all...
I'm fine.
The coughing, made worse by the stress and hunger, doubled him back over in chest-heaving coughs. Joseph said,
We can't know for sure, but we have to think this through carefully.
We can't take that chance. We have to exile you to...
Michaela was the linchpin that sealed his fate. She shrieked,
Blood! He's coughing up blood! He's got it!
Before Patrick could defend himself, Michaela, Geraldo, and Harriet fell upon him in a flurry of punches, scratches, and kicks. Lewis tried to scream for them to stop, but his voice was overwhelmed by the collective screams. Whipped into a frenzy by the mob rampage, Andrew and Jenny joined in on the attack against their defenseless coughing classmate. Patrick covered his face as punches and kicks rained down on him from all angles. They shrieked, scratched, stomped, and struck at the helpless athlete. Geraldo's boots caused the most damage, but in reality it was the combined might of the mob in those furious seconds that ended Patrick's life. No one knew who dealt the coup de grace, but by the time Lewis, Edward, and Jonas were spurred into action, it was too late. For the sake of honesty, he was dead before the beatings. Before Michaela's condemnation, Patrick Finnegan was dead the moment he started coughing. Those who didn't participate in the mob mentality pulled the others away, Jonas tearing Wakefield away and into a nearby desk that tipped over. Lewis dragged Michaela and Harriet back by their hair as they shrieked in surprise more than pain. And Edward slammed into Geraldo, which sent both of them tumbling past Patrick's broken and bloody form. Joseph ran forward to check on Finnegan's twitching and twisted body. He couldn't bring himself to touch him for the fear that his blood was infectious and infection was a death sentence. But it didn't take a doctor to tell his condition. His forearm looked like a broken stick, and his face could only be compared to red jello. He turned to the class, some of which were on the floor, some of which were struggling against the hands that held them now, all of which were staring in abject terror at the bloody form that lied before them. And he said,
He's dead. Semper Fi, Marinus.
Michaela was the first to react, to the realization that they had killed Patrick. She sank to her knees, inches away from his ravaged form, and broke into tears.
Sangre de Cristo, ¿qué hicimos?
Her tears galvanized Jennifer into a blind fury. She slipped free of Lewis and delivered a powerful backhand to Michaela as she wept. The force slammed her into Patrick's corpse. She roared,
You bitch! We were going to quarantine him! You did this! He's dead because of you! Did you even see him coughing up blood?
Harriet tried to pull her away, but Jenny broke free from her grasp and grabbed Michaela, who was a sobbing mess, by the hair and threw her backwards. Michaela was too shell-shocked to even register that she was being slapped. Jennifer broke down at Patrick's corpse and wept over him. She muttered nonsensical things to him like whispers in the ear of a lover.
Está loca. Estaba enamorada de él.
She surprised the entire class when she bent over his prone form and planted a long kiss on his cold necks. Geraldo didn't have long to register the shock before Lewis caught Andrew unprepared with a right hook that sent him into the floor, rubbing his jaw. He shouted,
We could have talked this through! You just had to instigate and prick and prod them all, didn't you?
Wakefield snapped back.
I didn't see you stopping us. Admit it, you was scared shitless just like everybody else.
The musician was on the instigator in the blink of an eye, and the two struggled on the ground. Michaela took the opportunity to take reprisal against Jenny like a clawing, screaming banshee.
Llorona.
The situation developed into a fighting and screaming clusterfuck. Everyone lost their marbles except for him and maybe Jonas. Geraldo knew what had to be done to restore order before it was too late.
Necesitamos estar tranquilo o todos vamos a morir antes del militar pueden salvarnos.
He reached into his pocket and retrieved his last resort, his lucky charm, his butterfly knife. He had carried this 4-inch blade to school with him every day since he saved up enough money to buy it. He wanted to be prepared for everything. Geraldo watched the news every night that was laden with stories of dirty bombs, hostage takings, and public executions of infidels. He dragged the knife across the chalkboard with such a screech that all the fighting stopped and everyone's hands shot to their ears.
Ahora, we need to calm ourselves, or...
G.I. Joe has a knife. How long were you holding out on us? Hand it over.
He went to move forward, but Geraldo raised the knife in an unmistakable stance that stated the only way he was going to get it was to kill him for it. Jonas said,
A knife doesn't change your status any. We're not going to escape with that, and thinking it'll restore order is only going to form some sort of police state amongst us.
Edward said.
What are you proposing, Geraldo? You have all our attention.
The idea hadn't settled on him until Jonas spoke, but now it wrapped its tendrils throughout his brain and refused to be torn out.
We're going to destroy ourselves before the scientists can engineer a cure.
They ain't gonna save us, Jawhead.
If we keep this paranoia and insanity up, we are going to starve if we don't get help. The answer is simple. We need to go out to the front lobby and surrender ourselves to the military to be placed in a real quarantine where they can provide us with food and take blood samples.
Wakefield shouted the idea with a horrible accent.
You loco, ese? They shot our teacher full of more holes than Swiss cheese for trying that.
Hate to agree, but they don't seem to be the type to try and approach a situation like that with kid gloves on. Geraldo pressed.
We're going to the lobby and we're going to shout our intentions to them. We can negotiate from there. If we stay here, we're going to tear ourselves apart.
I don't know if that's going to work. Any action like that can be viewed as an act of aggression.
The Jawhead responded.
We don't. You don't have a choice.
He raised his knife in a threatening manner and said,
We are going down there if I have to force all of you at knife point.
Lewis stepped forward with his arms raised and said,
We can't do that. They'll shoot us. Ya basta. Tengo que mostrarles que no estoy jugando.
Geraldo stepped forward with alarming speed and brought the knife down. Lewis sank to the ground with the weight of the jarhead pinning him to the ground. The jarhead was on top of him and buried his butterfly knife into the space between his shoulder and chest. He snarled.
We must surrender ourselves. They are right. They're always correct. They wouldn't mislead us. I'll kill you if you say otherwise.
This wasn't Geraldo anymore. All that was left of him was a museum of fear. Lewis screamed in pain as the knife dug deeper into his left socket. His hand grasped the knife and tried to push it back out of his wound, but the jarhead pressed it back down. It was clear by the look in his eyes that Geraldo had lost all semblance of thought. His plan was going to get everybody killed. He was going to kill anybody that stood in his path. The musician swung at him with his right and connected with the left side of his face. The aggressor dropped back, but tore the knife out of the wound as he went, as a means to defend himself should the attackers come. Lewis regained his footing as Geraldo charged forward to continue the attack. The musician managed to grab the arms before they could be brought down onto his chest.
Tengo que matarlos a todos. Solo puedo salir. Van a traicionarme eventualmente. Tengo que sobrevivir.
Lewis managed to fend off the attack, but it was obvious to the jarhead with the pain lancing through his shoulder that he wasn't going to hold off this fight for long. Geraldo pushed forward and shoved his target against the toppled desk. Lewis fell back and the soon-to-be soldier brought the knife down on his chest, not knowing that it would be his downfall. In his shock, instead of pushing, Lewis pulled and changed the trajectory of the knife completely. Geraldo fell on top of him and pressed the blade deeper. He didn't feel it at first, but once the shock wore off, he became aware of a caustic stinging sensation in his chest. The two bodies were intermingled for a few seconds before Lewis slipped off onto the side, and the jarhead rolled onto his back with the knife buried just below his ribs in his diaphragm.
Estoy jodido.
The class gathered around him as he lay on the tile floor.
Vamos a morir aquí, ellos. Pueden limpiar a sangre fácil con agua y cloro. Bien suavecito. Estamos fregados.
Every breath came out in a rattling gasp that felt like razor wires were being wrapped around his lungs. He knew he was dying. He felt tendrils of a frigid sensation enveloping his body. He wheezed.
Mama, lo siento mucho. Solo quieres escapar. No es mi culpa. Chris.
He reached towards an invisible phantasm, and when his hand sank down, he was dying in a series of twitches or rasping gasps. The last thought he had was the realization that he was escaping, in a sense.